Ahoy, I'm Cliff Neve with Mad Security, and my presentation today will be on less jaw work, more paw work. How do we start actually doing cyber? And it's very exciting for me to be here at DEFCON, HackTheSea. It's my first time participating in this village, and so I'm looking forward to it and hopefully interacting with some of you all. What I'm hoping here is to maybe generate some dialogue, and the bottom line is that I don't feel like we've gotten as far as we could have. There's been a lot of talk. We've been involved in this for, gosh, over a decade now. I've been involved with maritime cybersecurity, and I think we could all agree that we could actually be farther than we are. So hopefully, what I'm trying to do here is present a little bit of a framework for how that we can push the ball forward and get that rolling a little bit better. Hence the term less jaw work, more paw work. Since it's DEF CON, I figured I'd start right out of the gates by keeping it real and start the discussion about why we suck at getting traction, right? And so one of the biggest things is that the people at the top, the decision makers, they have historically made information technology an IT thing. And it's never really been a business thing. It's something that a lot of the executive leaders fear technology. They don't want to learn it. They're just like, keep it away from me. So there's a complete lack of board and executive members who understand business risk at the highest level, and therefore it doesn't get the attention that it needs at that highest level. The next thing is that cyber is actually now considered kind of sub-relegated under IT, and I think that makes it even harder. IT has a tough enough time getting the attention that it needs at the highest levels, but most of the folks that I talk to at the ports and things like that, cybersecurity is under information technology still in a lot of cases. So it's buried even a layer deeper than information technology is at some of the places. Now, some of the places that have been hit by cyber, they've escalated it, but it shouldn't take that. Really, cybersecurity is its own discipline, separate from IT. We all know that here. But at a higher level, those folks don't seem to really understand that. And as a result, they keep cybersecurity and information technology at arm's length, which does us no favors on the budget level. And it results in what I have as number 3 here at why we suck at getting traction. That's because cyber risk is not usually integrated with other enterprise risks. I recently went to a port where I asked that question. I said, look, when you go through and you do a gap assessment, when you figure out what's wrong and you have your vulnerabilities, are those briefed in the same context at the same meeting, at the same risk management meeting that physical security risks and weather risks and ship maintenance risks are briefed? And the answer is almost always no. It's kept as its own separate thing at arm's length from those high levels. And as a result, this particular port, they had their own police force. I mean, we're talking easily 7 figures, well into 7 figures. And, yet they were struggling to come up with any kind of resources whatsoever to do any sort of network monitoring, logging, anything like that. All those budget requests, they just were not getting any traction. But boy, I'll tell you what, the police vehicles sure look nice and brand new. So why is that happening? Why are we losing? And unless you're actually able to articulate what those cyber risks are, then you're never going to be able to get the resources. You're never going to be able to get those types of things. And on another note, regulation isn't really the answer. I mean, regulation can force people to get to where they need to go, but they're usually not going to do it right, and that's kind of another conversation. Number 4 is we make it more complicated than it needs to be. Actually, doing cybersecurity, the technology piece is hard, but the actual implementation of a cybersecurity program is not very hard. All it requires is almost like a project management situation where and I'm going to go through that later on, that there's actually steps you take to implement a cybersecurity program. And we like to dive into the bits and bytes and from the movie Hackers, how can you tip over a boat, using, and make it really incredibly technically challenging. But at the end of the day, it's usually the dumb stuff that gets you. It's usually the lack of hygiene. It's usually those kinds of things. Those Stuxnet and those types of things, solar winds, those are actually very, very rare, as we all know, within cybersecurity. It's normally the dumb stuff that gets you, other than maybe on the operational technology thing where we all as a community need to get better at our operational technology patching practices and things like that. But the bottom line is that we make it more complicated than it needs to be, I think, sometimes. And that's what results in those decision makers not wanting any part of it. They see that you have to be in your basement eating Doritos, drinking 8 Red Bulls and Monsters in order to be able to understand it. The other thing that I see is that many ports and other organizations try to handle it themselves. They want to actually buy the technology themselves, administer the technology themselves. And at the end of the day, unless you're a really giant port, you're never going to get the resources you need to have your own security operations center as a service. You're really not going to have your own SOC capabilities. So I think that trying to do it yourself, trying to buy the technology and putting together those plans doesn't resonate from a business perspective with the higher ups that are making those decisions. One of the distinctions that has to be made with the decision makers in your organization is the difference between security and compliance. And Scott Dickerson, who's with the MTS ISAC, he and I have this discussion all the time about how do you make the decision makers understand that you don't just have to check the box, that checking the box isn't really getting you to where you need to go. And it's really usually only marginal effort to get from compliant to being actually secure. And so you have to help those decision makers understand that it's an investment and that you're buying risk down by actually being secure. And where compliance will check the box and meet regulatory requirements, security actually builds the capacity to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so having folks that are executives that can understand this and helping them understand this helps us all out to collectively raise the bar in our maritime transportation system cyber efforts. So in trying to explain compliance versus security, I find it's very helpful sometimes to show physical world analogs to what's going on in cybersecurity. And so here's a great example of being compliant and not secure. You want a locked gate, there you go, there's a locked gate. You want a firewall, there you go, there's a firewall with any, all. Very, very similar analogy there. Another one here, yep, you want a locked gate, sure, but we're going to go ahead and put the push to exit right there so anybody from the outside can go ahead and get in. And then finally, we have the gate that is supposed to block traffic from getting through, but clearly not really doing its job there. So you can be compliant without being secure, and these are good examples to show to hammer that point home. So at this point, I wanted to get into the paw work as far as how can you dig in and what are your first steps, because usually that's where people kind of stop and pause. So the first step in the paw work is that someone needs to be responsible. You have to have somebody designated to do the right thing, and if you don't have someone responsible that has the support of the executive leadership, then you're going to be at a disadvantage for the entire time. But if you don't, then put on your big boy or big girl pants and take it upon yourself to go to the higher powers that be, or start filling that role, because somebody has to be responsible. Next, know what you're defending, and I'll get into all these later on as we go, but knowing what you're defending is the next step. Then know who you're defending it from, solidify executive buy-in, select the appropriate framework and controls, conduct a gap assessment, remediate findings, and conduct continuous monitoring. So this is where I start to dive into the paw work, and if you notice that I'm in a different place with different shirt on, then that's because I'm on the move constantly, and so the next slides I'll probably have a little bit of a different appearance for that. So thanks for your understanding. Many maritime organizations have difficulty in determining who's responsible, but ultimately the most successful cybersecurity programs I've seen have been led by people who were authorized by the leadership and given full authority to be able to run the cybersecurity program. And it needs to come from the top, from the board, from the C-suite, and they need to be involved and need to be integral players in the cybersecurity organization. The second step is to know what it is that you're defending. The first part of this step is understanding what systems are in your organizational inventory, what the service level agreements are, what the availability needs are. Sometimes operational technology systems require a far more higher percentage of uptime, near 100%, than some of your IT systems do, where confidentiality and integrity might be more important. But it's key to understand all the different systems that are under your purview and what the service level agreement requirements are for those systems. The next step is to understand what data resides on your network, where the sensitive data is, who has access to the data, who should have access to the data, which is often two different things, and figuring out what types of, whether it's law enforcement, controlled unclassified information, trade secrets, personal identifiable information, where does that data reside, who should have access to it, and how are you going to segment out your systems, if applicable, to protect them and to limit the access to those sensitive data. The final part of this step is determining what kind of delivery channels and technologies you have and what type of connections you have that these systems reside on and that data resides on. So that includes understanding what third-party connections you have, what cloud connections you have, understanding the chart of your network and all of the different operational technology systems that you have, so that you can have a full inventory of everything that you have. That includes third-party access, which I'll get into next. Third-party connections should be scrutinized very strongly. You should minimize the amount of third-party connections that there are, because those introduce a great deal of uncertainty into your system that are frequently outside of your control. But they have to be accounted for, and they have to be secured to a commensurate level with the risk that they pose. The next step is to know who you're defending your information and information systems from. Of the different nefarious actors or activities that might make for a bad day for a network administrator or a cybersecurity professional. And we've seen all of these operators within the maritime community, whether it be organized crime, nation states, hacktivists, competitors, self-inflicted or natural disasters. So there's a lot of different threats that need to be accounted for in how you defend your information and information systems. The next step is how to solidify executive buy-in and how to gain leadership in your cybersecurity program. The single biggest problem we've seen in cybersecurity is a lack of leadership or leadership involvement. So it's important to engage leadership, and if you're leadership, to engage your FSOs and your IT and your cyber staffs to make sure that you're injecting business realities and doing the right things from an organizational perspective, and that you're evaluating business impacts, opportunities, risks, etc., as opposed to just chasing the latest and greatest technologies. The next step is to select the appropriate framework and controls to evaluate your network against. This is the step where a lot of people lose their collective heads and they kind of throw up their hands and say, we don't know what framework to use. The Coast Guard actually calls out the NIST cybersecurity framework as well as NIST 882 as possible frameworks to use, but they don't actually prescribe one, neither does IMO 2021. So you have a little bit of freedom in how you choose your framework, whether it's NIST 800-171, if you're a DoD contractor that has to be compliant with CMMC, that might be a good one. If you're an international entity, then ISO might be a good one, ISO 27000 series and the 27002 controls. But the bottom line is that here's where you need to work with a professional or figure out what your requirements are and choose an appropriate framework for your organization. The next step is to conduct a gap assessment against the controls of your chosen framework with your organization. Gap assessment, you do so using the prescribed framework that you've chosen, and you document any technological, personnel, or procedural gaps, and you also develop your plan of action and milestone, which is your project plan for how you're going to remediate those findings and get to where you're good. In some cases, you have latitude to accept the risk, is an organizational business concern. In some cases, such as DoD's CMMC, they don't allow you to accept risk. You have to meet all of the controls. But at any rate, what you'll need to do is to conduct your gap assessment and have your plan of action and milestones for how and if you're going to remediate each finding. The next step is to remediate the findings that were uncovered during your gap analysis. What that entails is generally going through and remediating your highest risk items first, although sometimes you might implement a service that might take care of 30 or 40 different findings or 20 findings or whatever all at once, in which case that might be the priority to take on the most number of findings in the most economical fashion. But the bottom line is it's a business decision in how you remediate these findings, but normally with an eye towards the highest risk ones remediated first. The final step is to conduct continuous monitoring of your network. Various elements that you might leverage as part of your Security Operations Center or SOC as a service. They include asset discovery, vulnerability assessments, threat detection, behavioral monitoring, human security behavioral assessments, and security incident event management, otherwise known as SIM. You should be conducting log aggregation, and in most cases I would recommend that folks outsource this. Unless you have a very large cybersecurity organization, it's going to be far more cost efficient to outsource this to a very good company that can do 24/7, 365 monitoring, that can go through your logs, that can look for advanced persistent threats, because most of your organic IT organizations just don't have time to do that well. They're not trained to do that well. You're not using a SIM and doing log correlation, log aggregation, and those types of things. But the bottom line is that this step means going through and actually doing monitoring for your networks and your hosts for securities, for anomalies that might be happening within your system. So summing up those 8 steps that I've laid out, I think it's a pretty decent framework to get folks rolling. I think that people try to skip steps. People try to do things piecemeal, pulse in, pulse out, everything else. But I think that if you follow these steps and you actually get moving on it, and you give yourself a little bit of time on each step, that you can actually get to where you want to go a lot quicker than just going and recommending some type of SIM technology or endpoint technology to your executive decision makers who have no idea what you're trying to do. If you actually get your requirements in place, you get your risk management vernacular in place, and you get things integrated with the rest of the organization, that's going to help you to actually get moving and dig in and be able to actually do cybersecurity. And at the end of the day, all those things build to doing your continuous monitoring and finding remediations and continual improvements and building those mature processes in place that allow you to get to where you want to go. But so oftentimes we see different organizations that are really relying on ad hoc, chaotic heroes, people who are, it's all on their back. They're the ones who are keeping things together with bubblegum and baling twine. And so I'm always open for feedback on this. If anybody has any additional steps that they think need to be added or steps that should be consolidated or whatever, I would always recommend that you reach out to me, and I'll provide my contact information here in the next slide. So thank you very much for having me, for listening in, and it's been an honor and a privilege to be a part of DEFCON's HackTheSea, and my very first one. And I look forward to continuing engagement with each and every one of you. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, always will be. I believe the importance of maritime cybersecurity cannot be overstated. And if y'all are ever in Orlando, please feel free to let me know. Hit me up. Would be glad to meet you out. Or have you over. Also would love to hopefully do this next year in person. Wasn't able to make it this year for personal reasons, but I definitely look forward to linking up in person with some of y'all next year. Take care and have a wonderful day.